Welcome to track B. This is a lot of people in the room, considering there's a talk about forms in the other room. So I'm actually very impressed there are so many people here. It's also, I said, it's proof that Fabian doesn't like the microkernel. The fact that he would put me against forms in the small room. And in a few minutes, I will prove to you that that is in fact the case. Even though Fabian is technically the person who merged the microkernel stuff. Well, not merged it, he actually was the one that wrote the microkernel. Though I get the credit for it. Kind of cool. So, let's get started. You guys all saw me this morning because you didn't have a choice. Unless you were, yeah, never mind, sorry. One shame face in the front. You may have seen me this morning if you woke up before 9 a.m. So you already know who I am. I will mention again my company, cambridgeuniversity.com. Please go there. Tell all your PhD friends and all that. We have lots of good stuff there. And we're going to be adding, I don't know if anybody cares because we have to validate it, but we're going to be adding more and more coding challenges in 2016. So there's already several screencasts where you actually have coding challenges and you write PHP code. Or you write, actually, in some cases, you write BHAT features, and there's some grading going on. And we do like really cool Docker stuff behind the scenes. We like spin up a Docker container and execute your code, then we grade your code, and it's really nerdy cool. So that's why I like it, but hopefully it's useful, and we're going to do a lot more of that. And where's Lane? There she is. Wave. So have you decided which song you're singing?
I'm still working it out.
Still working it out?
Yeah,
okay.
Pretty good.
Do you have a couple finalists that you're working on?
Top secret.
Top secret. Okay, so come to karaoke tonight. Leanne's going to sing. She's got the first song tonight. You know that's the case. So to kind of get us rolling. So I've been thinking about two problems with Symfony, of course, because Symfony is the only thing that I think about typically. One is that Symfony sucks, or at least I hear this a lot. Part of the reason I hear this is that I actually have a filter on Twitter for Symfony. So when you have a filter on Twitter for something, you're asking for to basically find hateful things. I actually stole this idea of showing tweets from Jordy. His keynote after this is fantastic, and he has like some of the funniest tweets that he's collected over the years. So this is a good one too. So yeah, so the first thing I think about is that Symfony sucks. This was almost a positive tweet. Right? It's like, yay! Boo! And this is the one that I'm really kind of getting after. Not specifically necessarily the Laravel thing, but the learning curve of Symfony. So when I say Symfony sucks, I'm actually talking about Symfony is too hard. It's too complex. I tried it, it couldn't work, or I looked at it for a few minutes and it looks crazy, it looks very complex. So that's the first thing I think about is it's too complex. And what do we mean by Symfony? In my opinion, we're not talking about the components. I don't often hear someone say, I tried to use this component and it was too complex. And sometimes they say it's maybe over-engineered. But typically they're talking about the Symfony framework and that being too hard. So the question is, what are the causes for this? So that we can fix them. A lot of you guys know the developer experience. It's the same thing, right? It's thinking about what's too hard and why, or why do people hate something. But thinking about Symfony, like, okay, so what is the Symfony framework? Well, it's really the idea of creating a route, pointing that at a controller, and the controller returns a response. And also, just to be friendly, you have this bucket of useful objects over here. Which when we're trying to terrify beginners, we call that the dependency injection container. So we know that will scare them to a different language. But it's just an associative array of useful objects, basically. So I'm not sure what about this is so difficult. In fact, Symfony, or Fabian has often said that Symfony 2 is much simpler than Symfony 1. And he's sort of like, I don't get why people think Symfony 2 is hard. And if you look at it right here, it's very easy. And in fact, every framework does this. And Symfony 2 is nice because you can get it down to the facts. You can actually remove all the pieces, because it's all decoupled, and get down to just code that performs these actions. So this is really what it does first and foremost. You can't take away more pieces. It does this. So why do people think it's hard? One is that I think common tasks sometimes require too much code. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but someone at their lunch was actually talking to me about that. There's certain things that it's subjective, but ideally we could help people out and remove boilerplate code or give them more boilerplate code. An example was I had to do a demo, I had to make a tutorial like 2 days ago and needed a simple login form. And I'm really good at doing that because I've done it 10,000 times. But even still, I had to go to Symfony.com and like copy like the login template and copy like the login controller. And creating the user entity, like I don't know how to do that by heart, but I realized I was creating the user entity. I was using all these shortcuts. But I was doing a lot of actual work. It's really easy for me, but it's not necessarily easy for other people. So sometimes tasks require too much code. That's what I want to talk, or that's what I want to say, but I'm not going to talk about that more. What I want to talk about, as you might tell from the title of this talk, is Symfony is too big. And this is something I've thought about a lot because when I give trainings, the first thing I want people that are new to Symfony to know is it's just route controller response. So I usually, when I give 3-day trainings, we cover like the route controller response thing in like the first 2 hours of the 3 days. And then I tell them, congratulations, you now know 50% of Symfony. Because that's really the first part. And if we can boil it down to that first part, it's actually very good for beginners. And this whole idea is actually going to be very good for microservices and things like that. So one of the causes of that is that too many files, and I've used this in my developer experience talk last year, too many files is a perceived complexity. So if you have 100 lines of code in one file, and then you take those 100 lines of code and you mix them into 20 lines in 5 files, people will think that's more complex. They'll see 5 files, especially if you move those files into directories. Whoa, then it actually looks harder. So it's just something to be aware of. There's a perceived complexity if you make them look into lots of places. So this is the Symfony Standard Edition, which has about 25 files and about 10 directories to get a Hello World application. And I realize that's a bad example because you don't get the Symfony Standard Edition to make a Hello World application, but this is your starting point. So if you have someone that's new to the framework, you sort of need to, they need to understand a lot at first in order to get the payoff of the Hello World. And so in fact, it takes us about 2.5 hours of learning concepts in the first part of my training for them to get that final payoff. So it's a lot of work in the very beginning. And of course, this also relates to experienced people when we talk about microservices or just small projects in general. Even for me, I'm like, oh, it's just this tiny project. I don't feel like getting the Symfony Standard Edition right now. I don't feel like having all that code. I just want to whip something together quickly, which is why I use Silex, right? And Silex is a fantastic tool for that. So, problem number 2 is actually that, is my project macro or micro. So you have to make that decision when the project starts right now. Do I use Symfony full stack or do I use Silex? Or some people might actually kind of make their own application using the components. I would say it's a little more Silex-like. So you have to make that decision, and the difference between those is, it uses all the same components, but we know they don't use all the same components. Silex has a different container. That's like the really important thing. And practically speaking, Silex doesn't use the bundle system. So it means that as soon as you use a Silex application, you can't use that bundle that you always like and use. A lot of times there are extensions to give you that functionality, but it's just slightly different. And you can't have Silex evolve into a full stack framework. I mean, you can use Silex like a full stack framework. You can give it a big directory structure and all that. But you'll never take your Silex app that you put together over the weekend, and then it becomes successful, and then like 2 years later, it's actually using the Symfony dependency injection and the bundle system. You're always stuck in Silex unless you basically rewrite it. So it's not the end of the world, but it's a cost to going with Silex. And for me, when I use Silex, it gets me started really quickly, and then I feel like sometimes the next few steps are a little slower because I'm not as good with them. It requires a little more setup. I'm just more familiar with using the full stack. So I thought a lot about this problem this year, and of course the obvious choice is, what if we just make Symfony smaller, and then maybe we can have our cake and eat it too, in a sense. So that was my goal. And I spent vacation in Croatia on the beach just thinking about this, and I can attest to this. I brought like a little journal to the beach and was writing in it. How many people are? Anything you want to repeat?
Yeah.
Okay. How many people are familiar with this article, series, or idea? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, that's kind of, actually a few more people than I expected. It's like, now it's 2.5 years old, and thought he never finished it. It's like, this article ends with like, next time, you know, you can see the ... here, right? This is like you got really busy right here. Just said, screw it, I don't want to blog anymore. So in this, he said basically how can we make Symfony framework in a single file. And actually, in this article, he only gets it down to about 5 files. So this is what it looks like in his situation. 6 lines, 6 files, 6 lines of code. That actually counts the composer.json. So that's actually pretty impressive. That's a full stack framework. We're talking like event dispatch. The events are dispatched. The container is there. Routes, controllers. Like it's those things we're talking about. What is Symfony? It has all of those. This is a fully functional Symfony application in 6 files, 62 lines of code. In a presentation at Symfony Live Portland this same year, so like 2.5 years ago, he actually went the rest of the way and put it inside a single file. And he had to hack the hell out of it for it to work. He actually used some FAR tricks. Yeah, you remember.
Halt compiler?
Yeah, he used halt compiler in order to embed a YAML file inside of a PHP file, and then use the results of that to pass it into Symfony. Because one of the... What's that?
That's how FAR works. That's what halt compiler was designed.
No, but it wasn't a FAR file.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, he was using he was abusing that trick. Yes. So in a FAR file it would be fine, but this was literally he needed to halt the compiler so he could barf out some YAML and then basically I think grab that YAML and then send it, treat it like a file or something like that. And part of the reason is like in Symfony when we load our routing and we load our container, you know, the register container configuration on the bottom, it expects a file. It says point me to a YAML file or an XML file. So it was possible, but it's actually quite difficult. And actually, this is what the kernel looked like. It has 2 bundles only, and the other method is register container configuration, and that went out and just loaded config_dev.yml, and then that file had just a tiny bit of configuration in it. I don't show it here. So that's pretty cool. So we can get pretty small. Can't go 1 file unless we do some really crazy stuff. So, you know, the question is, how small can we go in a realistic way without using halt compiler? You know, because that was pretty small, but not as small as I want. So I'm going to go back to like, what is a Symfony application? So let's boil down to what is actually the essence, so we know what pieces we can take away and what pieces we can't take away. So first, it's a set of bundles, which I'll talk about later. Bundles, well, I'll explain. It sounds obvious. I'm going to explain what a bundle is later, but you guys all know what bundles are, but it'll actually be interesting. But anyways, it's a set of bundles, it's a container of services, and it's routes. And actually, if you have a CLI application, it's actually just the first 2 and then replace routes with commands. But it's these 3 things in a web application. Cool? So let's keep track of that. So let's create a brand new Symfony full stack framework project from an empty directory. So step 1 is to require Symfony/Symfony. We all know now that this is a real operator from the game show. This is like the best practice operator, so you should use this one. It's the really hipster operator to use. So we grab Symfony, we run composer install. Great, okay? Now we have a composer.json and we have a vendor directory. Then we're going to create just an index.php, because I want to make things as small as possible to begin with. And here's my kernel, app kernel extends kernel, and when you extend kernel, here are the 2 abstract methods that we have to fill in. This is exactly what a normal application looks like so far. I do require the autoloader up here, but this is all fairly straightforward. So at this point, I usually would fill in these methods, just like before. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to introduce a trait. And this is the new feature in Symfony 2.8. And I'm going to show you exactly what it looks like towards the end of the presentation. But when you use the microkernel trait, you still have register bundles, but it implements register container configuration for you, so you don't have to. But it also has 2 new abstract methods. So long story short, when you use the microkernel traits, you end up with 3 methods that you have to fill in: register bundles, configure routes, and configure container. Which is the exact 3 things I just listed up that is a Symfony framework application. So now your job is to define your application, the 3 pieces you have. There's no YAML files or XML files. You just fill in PHP code here. This is an option that helps you build routes. This passes you the container. It also passes you a loader, which you can use to load external files if you want to. So let's start filling those in. First thing, the only bundle you need is the framework bundle. Okay, so we're going to include the framework bundle. Framework bundle actually comes with quite a lot. It could actually probably be made smaller and split into different bundles. We're just grabbing the framework bundle. In configure container, the only bit of configuration we need is a secret. Everything else can kind of default, but we make you give a secret. This is equivalent to config.yml. So when you call container arrow load from extension, by the way, this is the container builder. This is not the end container. This is during the container building process. When you call load from extension, that's just doing the same thing as that. Cool? So we give a secret, and then we fill in the configure routes method. And this route collection builder is also new in 2.8. I made it specifically for this use case because it was always possible to define routes in PHP, but it wasn't a great interface. Not many people did it anyways. So I said, if we're going to allow people to actually build routes in PHP and actually encourage them and actually give them a nice way to do it, let's actually give them a nice object to work with. So I'll show a couple examples, but that route collection builder just helps you build routes, and it's new in 2.8. And you can see what you give it is just the URL, that's the first argument, and the second argument is the controller. So behind the scenes, we know that's going to set the underscore controller key on the route. But as far as like just starting with this, it's two values. You know, here's the route, here's the controller that's going to be executed. And probably most of you know this is the service syntax for the route. So it's not like this microkernel only supports services. I'm just doing this because the kernel, as probably many of you know, is actually this object. So what I've done here is I said when I go to /random/limit, actually call random action right on this class. So then we make a random action that's still inside of app kernel. And what do we do in a controller? We return a response. Cool? And that is actually the entire application. The only thing we need to do now is just boot it and run it. So here's app kernel with its however many lines of code. We create a new app kernel, create a request, handle the request, send the response. That is open PHP, close PHP, single file, full stack, Symfony framework, no halt compiler. And it takes 52 lines of code. And I say 2 files because I'm counting the compose.json file. So from absolute beginning to absolute end, full stack framework, including a controller. So that's 62 lines of code I showed you earlier with Fabian's. He was cheating because he didn't actually have any routes or controllers. So it's actually probably more like 90 lines of code. So that's how small Symfony can be. And that's actually really exciting because that is a very good candidate for using it in like a micro syntax, like Microframework, micro projects, small projects. It's not as micro as Silex, and the point is not to replace Silex. The point is to give Symfony framework developers another option that's in the middle. Because it's still a little bit more complex than Silex. You can't pass closures to routes. You know, so Silex will always be simpler in that sense. You still need to pass like, you know, go to this class and call this method for the action. And I get this question quite frequently. I want to say again, this is the full stack framework. So I'll get questions like, well, does it work with FOS user bundle? Or can I do this? Like, it's the framework. It's absolutely the framework. There's nothing weird about it at all. This, like Guard, all I did was take what Symfony was already, what all the smart people did all the hard work, and then I put a small layer on top of it so that I could steal the glory. And it's the exact same thing here. It's a very small layer on top of things. Yeah, I'll talk about that later. So it has service container, it has routing, it has events, it has ESI and sub requests. It's compatible with third-party bundles. I was just trying to like think of random things you do with Symfony because it's compatible with all of them. And you know, because that's popular, it's fast as hell. Why is it fast as hell? Not because we did anything special. It just has less bundles. So it's naturally fast. So I think Javier benchmarked it on the Symfony blog, and it was like 4 times faster. He said on his like 4-year-old Mac, it was handling a request response cycle in like 18 milliseconds or something, and that included the web debug toolbar. So he knew it was 18 milliseconds. He actually clicked into the web debug toolbar and went to the profiler. So he had a single file Symfony application that provided him with a profiler and executed in 18 milliseconds, which is pretty rad. But the goal of this is not actually to create single file applications. That's more for an educational purpose, because I'm very excited to teach newcomers like, oh, you've heard about Symfony, you've heard Symfony's hard, right? Does that look hard? Does those 50 lines of code look hard to you? Pretty easy to understand. Now let's build on layers on top of that, and you can like understand things. Instead of giving them the standard edition and having to explain like, all the concepts at once until they finally have a little bit of victory. So the real goal is clarity and control. So clear in how files are loaded, how the whole system works, and giving you guys, really the more advanced developers, a massive amount of control over how to do things, and it being very easy to exercise that control. So let's build a slightly more realistic application. So github.com/weaverryan/docs microkernel, or just go to github.com/weaverryan and search for micro. So the finished part of this application we're going to build is already up there, so you can look at that. So requirements, this could be anything, but I say, okay, let's organize it a little bit, have some directory structure. Let's load our routes via annotation. We can load them via YAML also. Let's add the web debug toolbar and profiler, and we'll introduce Twig. So if this were an API, maybe you wouldn't introduce Twig and you would introduce some other tools. But let's see how small we can make this while also making it have a decent structure. So first thing I'll do, and you'll notice I'm moving things towards the Symfony Standard Edition, the way it's organized. So we'll move, instead of having everything in one file, we'll move the kernel class into app/app kernel, and we'll move the 5 lines of code that actually boot and send the application to index.php in the web directory. Cool, so 2 files now. In register bundles, we'll just opt into Twig bundle, because I want Twig, and SymfonyCon extra bundle, because that gives us annotation route loading. By the way, I don't mention it explicitly here, so I want to mention it now. The tricky thing with the micro approach is that for the first time as a framework user, you have to opt into features. It's very Silex-like in that way. Like if you use Silex and you try to go into a Twig template and like generate a route or generate a route, you can't do it. You need to actually install an extension to do that. So if you're used to Silex, that's actually very normal to opt into features. But in the full stack framework, we're like, we get everything all of the time. So it's not the case anymore, which is cool, but it's also a gotcha. I converted an app I had into the micro way, tried to make it really small, and then I got an exception from my base template that says is_granted is not defined, because I wasn't using the security bundle. So you actually have to be a little more intelligent. Yeah, is_granted does not come from framework extension. That comes from framework bundle comes from security bundle. So you need to install the security bundle if that's what you want. So I'll grab those 3 things, and this should look very similar. We'll add the web profiler bundle only in the dev environments. So this is almost identical, but just smaller than normal. So configure container. So we have register bundles, configure container, configure routes. Configure container, my configuration is going to get a little bigger, so I'm tired of doing it in PHP with arrays. You can keep doing it with arrays if you want to, but now I'm just going to load an external file. So this is really important. We pass you the container builder, so you can do everything in PHP if you want to. We also pass you the same loader as normal, so you can load external files. So we're giving you the option to do it in PHP, but you don't have to do it in PHP. You can just choose what you want to load. So I'm just loading config.yml. I'm not loading config_environment.yml. Just config.yml. And I think I'm going to come back to what's covered on the bottom. And then this is what config.yml looks like. So I have a little bit more configuration. Again, you may not ever realize it, but you actually need to activate the Twig engine. It's done automatically for you in the standard edition. So when you're doing this stuff, if you need to activate a feature, you can look at the standard edition to see what configuration there is if something is weirding you out. Here it is, the second part. Then in the second part of the configure container, we actually need to configure the web profiler bundle, but that's only enabled in the dev environment. So we normally have a config_dev.yml file, and it loads config.yml, right? We don't need to do that. You can do it if you want to, but we can actually check to see if the web profiler bundle is enabled. And this actually is very, very clear. It has nothing to do with environments. It's just like, if it's enabled, then let's configure it. And it just happens right here. And it kills the config_dev.yml file, which maybe you want, maybe you don't want, but we can actually have the same functionality without going across and having 10 files in the config directory. That's one of the more intimidating things for beginners. They look at that config directory and it's like 10 files. We spent like 45 minutes explaining like why there's 10 files and how they load each other and all that stuff. So here's configure routes, the third part of the equation. And it's the same thing. I say, okay, if the web profiler bundle is set, that's something we have, let's import the web debug toolbar and the profiler XML. Because you can do that with this builder, the route collection builder. So you can add routes to this, or you can also import external routes. So it's the same as the container. So in this case, you guys can see this actually takes away routing_dev.yml. We don't have to have that anymore, because this is usually the only thing you have inside of there. And at the bottom, I load my annotation routes. So that actually kills, in my applications, because I use annotation routes exclusively, that kills my routing.yml, which my application, my routing.yml was 3 lines of code that loaded annotation routes. So if you use YAML routes, you will probably still load routing.yml and put them in there. But if you use annotation routes, you had this pointless file before that had just 3 lines of code in it. All right, so this is our structure. App config config.yml, so only one YAML file. App kernel. Here's my controller. So I'm running. Well, that's the controller that has the annotation routes in it, and index.php on the bottom. So what's that? So like 6 files, and we now have introduced a lot more complexity. So this, I don't show you this controller, but this controller renders the twig templates. The twig templates live in the resources views directory like we always have. When I go to the page, it loads the web profiler bundle. So this is actually basically what Javier did. He actually kept it in a single file, but I found just a couple of files, and we actually have all the tools that we want in a normal circumstance. So again, it's clarity and control. This was actually very easy to do because I can actually use PHP logic in my app kernel to add if statements. You can't do that in YAML. You can't say in YAML, the following configuration applies only if the web profiler bundle is enabled. But you can do that in YAML because you just add an if statement and then configure it only if that bundle is enabled.
PHP.
In PHP, yeah. So let's think of a couple other like weird things that are a little bit easier now. So environment variables. Symfony has support for environment variables. Probably many of you know if you have like a Symfony _ or something environment variable that gets mapped to like a service parameter, which is fine. But this, if you have this requirement, it becomes a lot easier. It becomes more self-evident how you use environment variables because if you want, you can just put it this way. So maybe my config.yml has all of my configuration, except I haven't configured my database credentials, and then I just do it in PHP down here. I could also set parameters like this if I wanted to, but I'm trying to kind of keep things as small as possible. You don't have to use parameters if you don't want to. Environment control, so I'm talking here about like the dev environment versus the prod environment, not environmental variables. It also becomes very easy for the same reasons before, because we can actually use PHP logic inside of our code to kind of check things and then change configuration based on that. You can also build services, because I haven't shown this yet. I stole this example from Kevin. But that usually you're going to load external files to load the services, but you can also build your services directly in there. And if you couple this with the new auto-wired stuff in Symfony 2.8, which is totally controversial, but if you want to get super like rapid application development about it, you just give it the class. I mean, even use the PHP 5.5 syntax and set auto-wired to true, and in most cases that's just going to take care of itself after that. And you can also build routes. We saw this in the first example, but I want to highlight it again. So this route collection builder, routes arrow add, first argument is the URL, second argument is the controller, and then you can just call methods after it. It's a builder object, so think of like a form builder, and it has set requirements, set defaults, all the things that you're normally used to seeing as keys under your route in your YAML file. So yeah, it's just a nice interface for adding routes. So this is slightly related, but it's going to be especially interesting to you guys, because most of you are fairly seasoned Symfony developers. Bundle list applications. How many people are kind of familiar with this idea? Yeah, it's gotten fairly good traction. There's a blog post written by somebody that I don't know that wrote something about like bundle list Symfony. And when I'm sorting through people trolling Symfony on Twitter, I see that blog post tweeted quite a bit. And it's basically, can I make an application that, yes, uses framework bundles, but I myself don't have any bundles in my code. Because if you follow the best practices and you start moving all of your resources, like your templates and configuration, out of the bundle, at some point you look in your source directory and there's nothing there but PHP classes. And then you go, well, why the hell do I have a bundle in the first place? What is the bundle actually giving me? This just looks like a library now. So what? Oh yeah, I wanted to highlight, I kind of slipped it by quickly, but my application actually does not have its own bundle. I have an app directory, but there's no bundle inside there. So wait a second, what does the bundle even give me? Was Fabian like tricking us 5 years ago when he announced Symfony 2.0 and was like, bundles are going to save the world? Like, why do we get bundles in the first place? Well, bundles give you a few things. They give you services. So the number one reason you bring in an external bundle is because that external bundle gives you services, has services embedded in it. It also gives you a resource root. In other words, kind of templates, you say, I want to render this template inside that bundle, that kind of thing. Also translations, right? When the translation system boots, it like looks for a path in the bundle for translation files and loads them. And it gives you some magic functionality like commands. If you have a bundle and you make a command directory and you put something in there, then it automatically finds that command. And it has a couple of shortcuts, like the underscore controller syntax in YAML routing, at bundle : default : index. Right? It gives you makes those things possible. So what we're about to go over is like how you can make a bundles application. Not that you necessarily should or shouldn't, but it's interesting to see how little we use bundles at this point, and to clarify why we have bundles and why they're useful and what they're actually doing for us. So let's try not to use a bundle for a second. So first thing, I'm going to go through this list here. First thing is services. How can I get services without a bundle? Well, that's obviously a silly thing. That's already very possible in the standard edition. We now have this configure container method in the microkernel, so why would you need a bundle? You can just do it right here. This is Font Awesome. So I'm on a different computer that doesn't have Font Awesome installed, so that's why you see this weird private use thing about it. If you use Font Awesome as a real font, this is what you get when like the font doesn't exist. Oh yeah, but it's a thumbs up. No, it's a check mark. It's a green check mark. It's a beautiful green check mark. So this equals beautiful green check mark. It does not equal something that says private use, do not use, or something. Okay, second thing, resource groups. So if I don't have a bundle, where do my templates and translations live? Well, we already obviously have a spot for that. App resources is your application root. There's nothing that I know of that you can't put in app resources. So if you put everything in app resources, then you don't need a bundle, because you can just render everything from there. Translations can be loaded from there. So life is good. Oh, and even, this is kind of a side thing. You may or may not know this, but Twig has extra configuration where you can give it extra paths. So even if you didn't want to load things from app resources views, you can tell it to load, when I say north_pole to load things from resources views, and down there you say at north_pole / the path. That's called Twig aliases? Namespaces? Namespaces, thank you. It's like one of those. And that's something that you can already do in Twig. So you don't need to have a bundle for that. So that's that's a check mark. Very satisfying when it shows up as a check mark. Also a check mark. So magic functionality, registering commands. So if you don't want to have a bundle, you have other options. You can register your commands as a service if you wanted to. It's a little bit more work. Another one is Doctrine automatically looks for your entities. It looks for entities in your entity directory, and it loads up mapping information from there. So if you don't have a bundle, Doctrine won't look for your entities anywhere. But that's just a small amount of configuration. There's something, again, you can go in your config.yml file, and there's something where you can tell Doctrine to look in this directory for mapping files. And it's fairly easy, and we have that documented already. So you can also just say, hey, look in src / app bundle / entity directory. Look inside of there, even though it's not a bundle. And the last thing is shortcuts. This is kind of a cool thing. How many people knew that you could do this syntax for _controller? Well, that's cool. Hey, you can do that. Less people than I thought. So really, what Symfony wants for a controller is a function. So you are very free to give it the full class name : method name. You can see obviously why the shortcut syntax exists, because this one's twice as long. But I'm highlighting that the bundles kind of give you nice optional things, but they're not a required core part of what you're doing in most cases. You can always just do it some other way. Yep.
Can you use the typical syntax with arrays in PHP, like callback, key value?
When you're building PHP routes, have a callback as your controller.
As in here, pass first value in the array is the class name, second value in the array is the method name.
You can. Yes, you can. Yeah. I'm almost positive that you can do that, because the part of Symfony that figures out what the controller is this big, weird, ugly function that tries to figure out what value you pass to the controller. Was it a closure? Was it this string? And that functionality is the same one that's used in Silex. So it tries to cover every use case ever. So I'm almost positive it allows you to do the array, this object, or this class name, comma, the other one. But don't go in that. Oh, and the last one, Git repository. Most of you probably do this, but this is just an optional shortcut. This is actually Doctrine functionality, but Symfony configures Doctrine to have an alias for every single namespace. So what Doctrine really wants is a fully qualified class name. So again, it's one of those optional shortcuts. There was one trick, however, that was missing that made bundleless applications impossible, at least if you wanted to load annotation routes. And as silly as it is, it was this one right here. So normally when we load our annotations, actually, Yeah. If we load annotation routes, we usually give it a path of like at bundle / controller, right? Well, this is another one of those shortcuts that comes from your bundle, the ability to say at and then a bundle name. So if you didn't have a bundle when you were in your routing.yml file, there was actually no way to kind of specify a path, or no clean way to specify like a path to a file. Like you can use like .. but I don't even know what the root is. It's kind of weird. So this is actually something that was like legitimately blocking people from using bundleless application. So with the microkernel, that actually becomes just very obvious on how to do that, because you are working in PHP all of a sudden. So you can just undo __dir blah 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 and just pass it any directory that you want. So basically that was all to say, like highlighting like what we actually use bundles for, and it turns out not necessarily that much. So you don't need them if you don't want them, and with microkernel it just becomes more clear how you might accomplish a few things if you didn't have a bundle. So what about multiple kernels? This is something else that comes up. So why would you do multiple kernels? I actually usually say don't use multiple kernels, and I'm still going to say that. But if you have a microservice architecture inside of a monolithic repository, which is kind of a cool thing, it's 5 apps, but it's all stored in one repository, then you might want to have multiple kernels for each of those applications. And the biggest reason that you do this is for performance, because of course if you have one application, then it has 100 routes, but if you have 2 kernels, then you have 50 routes in one and 50 routes in the other one, so the routes will load faster. There's less services in both of them. So you can break your application into smaller pieces. Most of us probably don't need to worry about this, but especially as microservices get more popular, like this is more interesting. Now, doing multiple kernels was always possible, and there are certain people in the community, like intelligent people, I didn't recommend it, but that actually have always said that you should use multiple kernels. But it wasn't super obvious how to do it, because the way that configuration was loaded was not as clear as it could have been. So now the way that configuration is loaded with the microkernel is incredibly obvious. So let's pretend we still have the app kernel sitting over here, and that's kind of for our like web front end or something. And now we're going to create a separate API kernel. Okay? So we have API kernel, use kernel traits. In this case, I only load these 2 bundles. I don't load twig bundle, so that saves me some services that I don't need to use, so that's cool. Down inside of here in configure container, a lot of times with multiple kernels, it's complicated because you have a bunch of configuration you want to share, but then some configuration you don't want to share. So maybe we make sure the config.yml file only has the configuration that applies to all of our kernels. And then every kernel additionally has one configuration file for their specific stuff. So all of your kernels now can load config.yml. You can think of that as shared.yml, and then they load a YML file for their own thing. So it's super simple. It's like, I don't even need to explain it. I'm just explaining it because I'm like, see how obvious this was. It was less obvious before. Now it's like really idiot-proof. It's very obvious. You can load whatever files you want to. And then in configure routes, same thing. In configure routes, it's very, very obvious how we can load only some routes and not other ones. In this case, I'm loading things from an API directory instead of like an app directory, so I can load separate controllers. And then down here, the one thing to not think about is the git cacher, because you need to make sure that your container is cached in a different directory. By the way, the whole purpose of these 3 functions of what makes a framework is to create the cached container. The entire purpose of your kernel is to create the cached container. So you can really think of the cacher as your cache key. And you want to store 2 things in the cache, you need to have different cache keys for those 2 things. Well, it's the same thing here. This is going to create a different cache container than our other kernel. So we need to give it a different cache key, otherwise they'll both try to use the same directory and it just doesn't work out that way. And then your only job now is you have these 2 tiny kernels, they both load slightly different configuration, and you just have to boot the correct kernel based on whatever logic you want to. So this is like the simplest possible logic you could use to boot multiple kernels. I actually keep a single front controller, like index.php, and then I just say, if it starts with /API, for example, then use the API kernel, otherwise use web kernel. In this project, I renamed app kernel to web kernel. Cool. So you could have like multiple things like frontend.php and API.php, like 2 front controllers if you want to. It doesn't matter. The point is just figure out a way in your application, figure out if the traffic is coming from this place or this other place. But you don't need to create multiple web directories. You can if you want to, but that's adding kind of an extra layer of complexity. You can just put everything inside one file. And this actually works quite well. I was talking to John Wage who some of you probably know at like OpenSky. OpenSky is a large e-commerce built on Symfony 2, and they recently introduced this exact thing because they have a large admin panel, and so the loading of those routes is taking extra time. So they said, let's just move those routes into their own kernel, and then we'll just put a little if statement in front. If it starts with /admin, then load the admin kernel. Otherwise, we can let our front end fly because we've got rid of all the admin routes. And it works quite well, and it was actually, even on their application, which is quite big, didn't take that much work to do. But they had a performance problem. Well, not a problem, they wanted to optimize performance. We don't all have that problem, so don't run home and do this to your blog. I can do it to my blog, right, and then instead of like, you know, the 5 people would get a slightly better performance, you know, it doesn't really matter. Oh, and here's what the end structure looks like. So 2 kernels, you know, 3 configuration files, 1 front controller. So it added like only a couple extra files. Yep.
Why not just 2 apps?
2 projects?
Yeah.
That goes back to a subjective thing of do you want to have the monolithic repository or the non-monolithic repository. So I tend to like the monolithic repository, but that's up for debate and discussion. Yeah, if you did create 2 apps, then it would be fully separate. A little bit extra work because if you had shared bundles, you need to make sure those shared bundles are like kind of in your private repository and are properly versioned. But if you have enough resources, then you can totally do that. Yeah, totally valid. Okay, so especially if you guys like we're all Symfony developers, I want to show you how this actually works behind the scenes because it's really, really not interesting. Okay, it actually is interesting again in how easy it is. So you guys probably already know the answer to this. There's one person who absolutely hates the name microkernel trait, and it's this guy. This is from the pull request that he made. I sort of forced him to make it, but he technically made this. And this was one of the first comments. He made the pull request and immediately commented on his own pull request and said this is not a good name, and then followed it up with this. So this is why we're in the B room sweating. So you might wonder then, how did we make him call it the microkernel? And there's a simple answer to that. For Halloween, I dressed up as Fabian. Some of you know that, at Symphony Live San Francisco. And he thought it was really funny, and he really liked it. And I had this like moment of like great friendship with him. And then I said, hey, how about that microkernel? I really think you should call it microkernel, and I think you should merge it. Sort of like waited, and then he opened up his kernel, and he didn't even like doing it. He's like, oh, okay, I'll just do this. So if you look at the comments above the microkernel, like if you open the microkernel trait, look at the PHP doc above it, and if you look at its unit tests, it's just a bunch of nonsense about Halloween. Like I think he like does like a PHP doc that says, if you want to like make a route, then say like routes arrow add / I love Halloween, comma, default controller, colon, it's so much fun, or something like that. So like a little Easter egg in there. But anyways, yeah, he doesn't like name micro, but it is sexy, so we won that argument. But this is actually it. I'm not just cutting off any code. Except I took out the type hint on loader so that it would fit on my slide. I took out another type hint there for container builder. That's the entire thing. It's 20 lines of code. So let's look at what's happening here. By the way, there's only one new feature for 2.8 that's utilized inside of here. 90% of this is actually available since 2.3 or 2.0. So you may or may not have noticed that there's a closure loader for the container. So register container configuration is what you have at the bottom of your app kernel, and it usually says loader arrow load __ dir /config _ environment .yml. But instead of passing a string to a file, you can also just pass it a closure. And that's important because that gives you access to the container builder, which so far we only have this loader thing. So all of a sudden down here we have access to the container builder, which is really important. So the second thing we do is we actually pre-configure your framework key. So this is kind of like config.yml code, and we actually give you the router resource. So normally config.yml says router, a framework router resource, and it says like routing.yml. So we pre-do this, and we do kernel load routes, and we say type service. This is the only new feature in 2.8. Because it occurred to me this was the missing feature to make everything really small. Because before this, you had to pass the routing file, or the routing resource had to be a file name. There was no other way to do it. So now in Symfony, in general, if you just want to like write routes in PHP, there's just a loader for that. You can be like, you know, instead of loading like blah blah blah.yaml, just call this function on this service, and it will load the routes. Which is kind of cool, because then you can, as we do in this method, use if statements or something. You can say like, if this, then this, you can do configuration, you can still load external files. So this is kind of the key to the whole thing right there, and it's super underwhelming. It's just an added loader. I think that's probably like 50 lines of code. And obviously load routes is the guy down there, okay? And then the third thing, up here, is that in load routes, just for convenience, we create that new route collection builder, which is like the fancy, nice interface for creating PHP objects. And then we ultimately call configuring routes and configure container from the bottom, and that's it. So we basically like looked and said, how can we do a little bit of configuration so that we can have a kernel class that has register bundles, configure container, and configure routes. Because those are the three things that your kernel actually does. And make it really obvious how I would configure my routes or how I would configure my container. I like configure container a lot more than the name register container configuration that's past the loader. It's just not very clear what that does. All right, so what now? So if you guys have a big project, the microkernel makes sense. Use it for clarity. You can take the Symfony Standard Edition and use the microkernel. It actually changes almost nothing. It just basically says instead of having register containing configuration, I'm going to have configure container and configure routes. And if in configure container you load config underscore environment.yml, and if inside of your configure routes you load routing underscore environment.yml, basically, then boom, you just converted the Symfony Standard Edition into a microkernel. It's really no different, right? It's just a little bit more clarity inside of that class. If you're teaching, show it for simplicity. So if you're ever showing somebody Symfony or training or helping somebody, like, this is the place that I think that you should start. Especially if there's someone coming from the perspective of like, I heard Symfony is so hard. And then you'd be like, really? Looks pretty easy, doesn't it? And they'd be like, wow, that is easy. Everyone's crazy, it's not hard. And then obviously this is one that probably applies to most of us. If we have a small application that we may have otherwise used Silex, you can still use Silex, it's still a great solution, but if you want to, you can use the full stack framework and take advantage of the power. I mean, the power in terms of like performance, of course, because you get the cached container and cached routing file, but also just the power of like, you can use FOS user bundle, you can use Sonata admin bundle, like those things that you might need, but you can't get in Silex. And that's it. Thank you guys very much.
So is there a link that you would suggest to give to people who think Symfony is too hard?
Ooh, that's a good question. Is there a link to send to people who think Symfony is too hard? Yeah. Not yet, but there should be. We're going to do it on Saturday. Yeah. We actually we're going to make some changes probably to the documentation section of Symfony.com to make sure that when you go to the homepage of the documentation, there's a button there that says like. Getting started, or I'm a beginner, and inside of there we'll have some new sections that actually say, oh, you're a beginner, let's walk you through a proper process. Whereas right now we don't exactly have that. Yeah?
Why is the microkernel trait a trait?
Why is the microkernel trait a trait? You know the answer to that? Okay, great question. The microkernel was not originally a trait, it was a base class. So, you know, our class extends that. But because it uses the closure, and because the closure calls a method on, this one right here. This is why we did it as a trait. Because that doesn't work in PHP 5.3. PHP 5.3, this can't be called inside of a closure. It can in PHP 5.4. So all of a sudden, Bobby realized unless he made load or configure container public, then he would have to. Because configure container is protected, so he basically said
traits don't exist in 5.3.
Exactly.
So why?
So basically, because he realized that this was only, other than doing a hack to make this work, okay, so to make this work in 5.3, forget the trait stuff. Let's imagine it's a base class. you would have to basically say like $kernel equals this, and then say use kernel, and then you'd have to call kernel configure container, but that now means that this would need to be public.
It doesn't work even here. You can't use this in a closure. Period.
Yes, you
can.
Yes, you can.
In 5.4 you can.
The scope. Is the scope different?
What does this?
This works fine.
Yeah, this are fine. In
The
5.4.
scope is, okay, you know.
So basically, the configure container would need to be public in order to like make this work in 5.3. And Fabian already didn't like this and was like, I don't want to make it. Now it's all really dirty because I have to make this public. Why don't we just not support 5.4? And then somebody else is like, or 5.3, and somebody else is like, if it's only 5.4 and up, let's just make it a trait. And so that's why it's a trait. That really
Answer the question.
Yeah, but why not just make it a base class?
I just looked at the pull request again. It was Nicholas Grekus, and he's far more intelligent than I am. And I don't really arguments, but he had a decent arguments. I mean, right, it's nice because we have single inheritance, so in theory you can now send a different base class. I don't think that's too common of a use case. Yeah, I mean, in theory it makes it more accessible potentially to like Drupal. Drupal has like a Drupal kernel. Now Drupal's still far too big to probably be able to use it without some work, but in theory, they could have Drupal kernel which implements this traits but still extends like their core kernel to us. So there you go. Yeah. That was a good technical specific one. Yeah.
Yeah. So you removed everything from the kernel, but secret. Why?
Yeah.
It was that way already, and I thought about changing it, but I think it's just a security problem because it's used for secrets for encryption. So I think it would be unpopular and be rejected if we automatically chose something for you.
Yeah, because when you define a new project, everything starts with a framework and all of the stuff that you need to put inside the config YAML. And with the starting project, this is my new secret or my non-secret. It doesn't make sense at all.
You think it doesn't make sense to have to choose a secret?
Yeah. No, it makes sense.
Oh, it does make sense, yeah. Yeah, exactly. New project, what is your secret for the project? Yes. In theory, it's a little bit, like in theory we could not do it. I actually thought about it because I wanted to have this really cool thing where like you plug in a framework funnel, no configuration needed, right? Because the secret's not used everywhere. So in theory, we could do like work inside of Symfony that say don't throw an exception until the secret is needed. But it actually ends up being a little bit technical, so probably not worth it. So it's kind of cool, like, hey, you have an application, security is important, so what's your secret? Set up your secret for this application, so that if and when you need it later, it just works. Yeah, right there.
How do you do cross kernel routing?
Cross kernel route. Oh man, I just had a Symfony 1 flashback. Anybody else have that? That's crazy. I hadn't thought about it before because in Symfony 1, it's like you always had like a front and a back. We actually had multiple applications, basically multiple kernels, and that was like one of the questions always is like, how do you route from the back to the front? And there's like elaborate things where you would like, well, actually, I'm gonna answer this in the Symfony 1 way. Basically, you don't. If you want to, then you would need to implement something for that. Slash, my Symfony 1 answer, if I remember there was like an elaborate library that did this for you, and it actually did it by inside of like the backend app that would like boot the front end app. Yeah, you can do that. So in theory, you don't need to do that. In theory, you could just boot the other application's router. You would have to do that manually though. You'd have to be like, I know how the router is instantiated, so I'm going to kind of like say new route, whatever, or something like that, and load from the same resource, and then you can get it to work and only have to boot the router. So that would be the way that you would do it, well, without booting the whole other application. But basically, it's not supported. It's like two microservices, right? So it's the same problem as like two microservices on two different URLs. How do you share those URLs? You either hard code them in here, or this one somehow advertises what the URLs are here, depending on what you want. Yeah, good question. Yep.
I do not have a question, I have an input. Yeah, if you like silence and you'd like to use it in a full stack way, it's possible. So I made a project called Saxalone. I'm sure I'm probably the only one at the moment using it, but it looks like so. But there's nearly everything available that in the Symfony standardization is available. The only real problem in a perspective from a Symfony developer is no bundle support. But everything
Yeah.
else, providers, everything, they call providers in Silex, is available, or annotation routing and so on.
Yeah, that's very good. So that's actually a good thing, like if you can use Silex, then that's something where you can get more tools on Silex. So that's very good. Still, my goal is like I needed the bundle system. Otherwise I am sacrificing an entire community like open source Symfony bundles that I suck at programming, but I don't have access to them. Anything else? Alright, I'm gonna let you guys go free. Go get some air.